Can you hear? Oh, you can hear me very well. That's good. Welcome, and thank you very much for having me here this evening. It's a delight to be here. And Michael asked if I would like him to wax lyrical before and introduce me, but I said no, so I'm just going to say, I thought I'd let him off the hook on that one. Many of you will know me anyway. I'm Mandy Harvey. I live in Eden Hills, and I am married to Paul, who works in IT, and we have an 18-year-old son called Thomas, who wants to be an actor. You would have picked up, obviously, that I am a POM. It's quite obvious. We migrated here 16 years ago and have lived in Eden Hills pretty much that whole time. If some of you who don't know me kind of know my face, it might be because I worked 11 years at the pharmacy just across there, John Spicky's as we affectionately call it. I worked there for 11 years, but since a year ago now, I'm now a chaplain at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, which is just a wonderful, if harrowing at times, job, but it is beautiful. And I run a little spirituality consultancy called Soul Seekers, where I offer spiritual direction and spirituality short courses to anybody who wants to grow their spirituality through the Christian contemplative tradition. And lastly and not least, I have been a Uniting Church minister for many, many days. 16 in fact, and I was ordained here a couple of Fridays ago, and it was a really lovely service. From what I understand, the reason I've been asked to speak this evening is because I wrote this little book. I don't know if you can read it terribly well, Musings from My Garden. It's a little book of reflections, which was the result of my making space to take 6 months as a complete non-gardener, and I can't tell you that I've become a gardener since that time, I really haven't, but I decided to spend 6 months in my garden, to do it silently and largely on my own. I did get a little bit of help, and I just reflected on the process. So other than look after my family, and I worked 2 days a week at Spicky's at the time, I did nothing else but work in my garden, and I decided to journal it as I went. And 4 years later, after that time, which was last year, at a friend's suggestion, she suggested that I might like to try and get that published, which I did, and that's what it has become. But it is not my intention to plug my book this evening, although Michael did say to me, unashamedly plug it, he said. So I will, just a little bit. So if you did decide that you wanted to purchase it, it costs, I think, $13.95, and you can get it from Mediacom Education there. There's the website. So if you do buy it, I hope you enjoy it. It's also not my intention to say to you, you should do the same, go into your garden for 6 months. We're all individuals, we all do things differently, and I realise it's very tempting within our culture to say, because I did it, you should do it too, and it would be good for you. I'm not going to suggest that actually, but I want to ask a deeper question. You know, what is at the heart of why I would do that in the first place? Why would we make space to do something like that? What's the purpose of it? So, and I realise you're not going to be able to read that very well, I do apologise, but this is the structure of our evening. So, why make space? Under that, who or what are we making space for? The countercultural nature of silence, lessons learned from making space. It can transform, it can reveal truth, and it can become the foundation. And then we'll have some tips for making space. There's no rush. Get used to silence, which we did a little bit earlier on. I'll be interested to see how people found that. Create a regular routine, and finally, ... And then after that, we'll have some time for questions if anybody has any questions. And we'll do a little bit of a practice of something contemplative as well, which I hope you will find helpful. So our question, why make space? We do live, I'm sure we all realise, in a manic, activity-driven, consumeristic world. So the usual answer to that question, why make space, would be we need to make time for ourselves. We need some me time. And in a sense, that makes sense. Self-care is really important. We need to look after ourselves. And indeed, there is a multi-million-dollar well-being industry dedicated to help us find me time. There are phone apps, wellness retreats, exercise groups, all sorts of things. And in one sense, there is nothing wrong with that. I do it myself. I have recently downloaded a yoga app onto my phone. It's very good, I am not, and I'm just learning quite how inflexible I am, and quite often my husband will come home to find me in some kind of very strange contortion on this mat, and he's like, what are you doing? But I think with all these things we need to be a little bit wise, because my feeling is there's this kind of pseudo-spirituality behind a lot of it. It teaches us that we're spiritual, but it's really all about me. It's my self-improvement and my well-being. And in one sense, as I say, there's nothing wrong with that to a point. But this is not really the making space that I'm talking about this evening, although it does very much include self-care. But I'm wanting to tap into something deeper that goes beyond me time. So, if making space isn't about making space for me, what is it about? Who or what are we making space for? For me, making space is about making space for that which is within us and beyond us. We are making space, or in my view, we are making space for God. Now, I recognise that God is not very popular in our world today, at least not in the traditional sense. And I recognise also, as part of institutional religion myself, we've not done a great job of promoting God. But I want to say that I'm not talking about God in the sense of the big white man up in the sky who looks down and judges our actions, etc. This is not what I want to talk about here. And I'm a bit nervous about even using the word God, because I know that word has connotations, but I'm talking about a wider idea of God here. God who is interwoven within all things. Some may refer to the universe, Mother Nature, the Christ. My boss at the QEH refers to the greater governance. I like that. The ground of our being, a God of all love, within but beyond religion and all things. So the making space I'm talking about expands our idea of what God is or who God is, and it is about growing in our awareness of God. I like this quote. It just happened to be in a book I was reading recently, and it kind of makes the point. If we are to remain motivated on our spiritual journey, we need to focus upon a goal more ultimate than our own self. So the difference between the wellness industry, it teaches us, as I say, not always, but there tends to be this kind of pseudo-spirituality behind it that promotes that we are all powerful, in control, we need to self-actualize. The making space I'm talking about, and that includes the making space for silence and solitude, we learn something a little bit different about our place in the world. It teaches us humility. Humility, the word comes from the word humus, which means earth. Humble means, therefore, to be of the earth, to be earthy, real, aware of reality. So humility is about being aware of reality, of truth. What is the truth? We are finite beings, we're mortals, we live and we die. We have great strengths, but we also have deep frailties. Our presence on earth is gift, and we are not here of our own choosing. And we have a limited time and space in which we make our mark upon this world. It is our choice how we spend our time, for good or for ill. What this kind of making space teaches us is there is a God who is beyond us and within us, the ground of our being, a God that wills for our good and good of the world. Making space is about becoming more deeply aware of that reality and the truth and the reality contained within our own lives. The counterintuitive nature of silence. Why particularly would you want to make space for silence and solitude? There surely are other noisier, more practical ways of making space. Why would we do it this way? If you scratch beneath the surface of any of the world's religions and spiritualities, they all have a tradition which includes silence. There is something about silence. Saints and mystics over the centuries of all religions and none, they all understand this, the importance of silence. It is counterintuitive. Our culture teaches us that we learn most through doing. Learning is an active process. We read books, we study, we learn through activity and doing things. Through making space for silence and solitude, we learn something deeper. There is a communication that comes from silence. We develop a deep sense of hearing that comes from within and beyond us. Has anybody got any questions or anything so far? Okay. This phrase, go sit in your cell and your cell will teach you everything. We're not talking about a prison cell here, by the way. This is of an ancient saying from the desert mothers and fathers. And when you take cell to mean room, your room, there is this understanding that as we sit quietly, it gives us space to hear what is going on within us and what is beyond us. We might have had just a little taste of that in the 5 minutes in which we did that before. You can imagine what it might be like if you did it for longer and more regularly. This tells us this understanding that it's the sitting still that is where we will learn the deepest lessons of our life, just through sitting with ourselves and with God. So I want to share with you a few lessons that I've learned from making space, and particularly that 6 months that I spent in my garden. I want to say that time in silence and solitude makes a difference, but I want to put some meat on those bones, and tell you some specific things, because otherwise it's all a bit airy-fairy, isn't it? And I can say it, and but if we can actually, what specific things? Making space can transform. The reason I put this, and anybody who came to my little book launch, probably whenever that was, October, I mentioned this, but I wanted to say a bit more. When I wrote what became Musings, I spent 6 months in my garden, I was really angry. And part of my reasons for retreating at that time was to cope with it. I was in a set of circumstances where I felt I'd been hurt and was really angry. And I don't cope with anger well. I don't know about you. I tend to lash out with it. And I'd been thinking about being in my garden for a while at that stage, but it just got to the point where I fast-tracked it. And I said, I need to do it, and I need to do it now, because I was going to lash out, and I knew it. So I withdrew, essentially to find God and find myself in my garden. And I journaled it as I went. And it was years later, actually, because I wrote Musings 5 years ago now, and it was when it was published 4 years after that, that I noticed something about it. I'd been really, really angry. But if any of you read Musings, you will notice that it is not angry. It's not at all. My anger had been transformed into something positive and helpful. And from what I gather from people who've read it, they find it quite good. That's nice to know. But I was amazed by that. I was amazed when I looked at it and went, wow, I was so angry and so hurt, and this isn't. And so for me, that speaks of the Christian gospel, really, that, to put it very crudely, that God can bring real beauty out of shit. And that's what I felt about it. And I was just amazed by that. So that's the first thing I've learned, is making space can transform. And that has amazed me. Making space can reveal truth as well. Part of what I did with spending time in my garden was I would take what we might refer to as a sacred pause. So I would do this stuff in my garden, and I would, badly, but I did it. And then I would stop and I would retreat into my room. My way of doing that was to say the daily office regularly during the day. But I would go off into my room for reflection and silence. And I practiced a particular practice known as Lectio Divina, which means reading with God or sacred reading. Do any others know of that practice? Yeah, okay. There are a few who do. We're going to practice that later because this has been something over the years that's been really, really helpful for me. Lectio Divina is a practice traditionally done in monasteries, and it's in essence a reading. It would traditionally be done with scripture, but it doesn't have to be scripture. It can be sacred poetry, or it could be a book that you find helpful. And the idea is to read a passage out loud a number of times. And the purpose is not to learn what the passage means. And if anybody's ever been to any kind of Bible study, usually you're sitting there trying to work out what it means. And this is not what this practice is about at all. What you're wanting to do is listen to what stirs within you. What comes up as you read? In what way does it speak to you very personally? And this is the practice that I was doing at this time in my garden. I can't remember, I was doing it with scripture at that time. I can't remember the scripture passage that I was looking at, but I do remember what it drew out of me. What I was reminded of was of an incident in my childhood when I was about 10 years old. And it was an incident that had so knocked my confidence that since that day, I had become too afraid to achieve my goals. I hadn't seen it until that point. I hadn't realised it. And at that point, as I'm sitting in my room, I realised that essentially what had happened to me was that I'd become a self-saboteur. I became all talk. I had big plans and would nearly get there on so many things, but then I would stop through fear, never see them through, and move on. So what the consequence of this was basically somebody who's really, really highly qualified but never actually did any of the things she was qualified to do. So I'd become an underachiever. And I saw it. I saw it for the first time. And that it had been this incident in my childhood that had caused this chain reaction. Now you might think that that was a terrible thing to learn. But actually it wasn't. Because I saw it, it meant that I'd been able to work through what had happened at that time. And since that time, that was 5 years ago now, I've done a number of things, ordination being one of them that I was terrified of, but I did it because I promised myself I would never again not do something because I was afraid. And so making space meant that I was quiet enough to finally realise that. And so making space reveals truth, and it's so important, even though it can be really confronting. And making space can become the foundation. Over the years, by the time I had spent this time in my garden, I'd actually been carving out space for silence and solitude for a number of years, which culminated in this 6 months. Since that time, I've become much more active, actually, and I do much more with my life. But the silence and solitude has remained a foundation. I've been able to move through the fact that I was a self-saboteur. And silence and solitude has become a foundation for a much more active life, with silence being the absolute cornerstone of that. So there's a sense in which there's this pendulum swinging between activity fueled by silence and solitude, moving back into silence, back out into activity. And that's how it goes. And I've found that it keeps us rooted in humility, in the truth of who we are, which leads to compassion as well, by the way. As you begin to learn who you are, you have compassion for others in similar situations. And the understanding that we're here due to and undergirded by God, the ground of our being. And it is this making space that means that I have the strength and the courage to do what I do. And I can tell you that working in a hospital, I've needed it because I wouldn't be able to do the job. Quite literally, I would not emotionally be able to do this job if I didn't spend time in silence and solitude. So I want to give you a few tips, some practicalities about this, a little bit of help along the way. Firstly, there is no rush. We are in a culture that teaches that we can have instant results with little effort. This is not true. I hope we're old enough to know that that's really not true. Deepening our spiritual lives does take effort and time, but it is a lifelong journey. It's gradual and it's gentle. Before I spent 6 months in my garden, I had gradually been making space for silence and solitude for a number of years, just adding little bits every now and again, practicing things, changing things. And I'm not suggesting, I mentioned this earlier, I'm not suggesting that you should all jump into your gardens and spend lots of time. I'm not suggesting you do that. It was a process that took a long time to be able to do that anyway. But this is your journey and not mine, and you need to do what's unique for you. So take your time, do things gradually, go with the flow. It takes effort, but you don't have to do it all in one go. Perhaps just introduce one small practice over the space of a few weeks or months. It doesn't matter. Each little step is a step in the right direction, and there's no pressure. But nothing of value ever really happens overnight, and the spiritual journey is no exception. Get used to silence. We had our little practice. Anybody want to say anything about how that was for them, by the way? Would anybody like to make any comments? No. You're all very good at it. You're being very good at it now.
I would just make one comment.
Sure.
I made it to some of the people at the table I was sitting at. I was finding it difficult to believe that 5 minutes had passed.
Okay.
I find 1 minute at Anzac Day or something, 1 minute silence, it just seems like an extremely long time. But this 5 minutes just felt like 1 minute.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah. Anybody else have any comments? No? All right. Marnie. That's an interesting one, isn't it? What am I meant to do? That's so much part of our culture, isn't it? You know, it's doing that is important. So yes, that's a really interesting one. Yeah. Anybody else? David, were you? Did I see you put your hand up? No. Okay. No. Okay. So silence is at the heart of this, of making space, and we live in a noisy, overactive world. And silence is not something that many of us are used to. And we tend to drown it out when we're on our own at home, don't we? You know, we'll have the TV on, the radio, music, activity. So I would encourage you to gradually introduce times of silence. Turn the TV or radio off when you are at home for a while. Learn to drive in your car without the radio on. Get used to spending little snippets of time silently and notice what happens when you do that. Sometimes we will find there's a lot of noise inside, and our brain, you'll be thinking about what you're having for dinner and what's happening and all that kind of thing. And sometimes there'll be some really uncomfortable things that come up. That's an invitation to deal with it. And you might want to find somebody you can talk to if you find that there's something uncomfortable that comes up. So get used to silence. Less is more. This is really important too. We live in a culture where we squeeze far too much activity into too little time. And the result so often is that we are too busy, too tired, and less productive. I think it's a really, really important lesson to learn that we cannot do everything. Come to terms with that and decide to do a few things well. Learn to do less, but do it better. Making space can help us to balance that out between the times of silence and solitude and activity. Come to a place of acceptance that we don't have time to do everything that we want to. And make space for silence and solitude as a priority, in my view. Personally, I have found life is more fulfilling with less activity, which is undergirded by that space for silence and solitude. So less is more. Create a regular routine. I think this is a really important one. If you are able to create regular times in the day for silence and solitude, however short it might be, you might find that initially you can only spare 10 minutes, and that's okay. Play with it, see what works for you. But try to make habits that are regular, that you can keep to. Put it in your diary and stick to it. Start small and build on it. Make regular spaces. You might want to include, as I did and I still do, sacred pauses. And I'm going to be giving out, saw them, they're at the back there. There are some handouts there to help you if it's something that floats your boat, some things on sacred pauses, on spiritual practice in general, and on the practice of Lectio Divina too. Equally, do not beat yourself up over it if you do not live up to your own expectations. As I said before, be gentle. There is room for error, and that really is okay. Every small step is a step in the right direction. And finally, during the 6 months in my garden, with my biggest revelation, and there have been many revelations over the years actually, but this was a particularly big one, that I was a self-saboteur, and this incident in my childhood meant that I was too frightened to achieve very much. And I was essentially a serial underachiever. All talk, little action. Now, as the reality hit, I had a bit of a crisis over that, because at the time that I spent in my garden, by the time I got to that, I'd spent 5 or 6 years gradually retreating further into silence. My friends, or many of my friends, thought I was withdrawn and a bit weird, quite frankly. And as I looked at it all and I saw how little I had done with my life, I started to think that it was all just a waste of time. I'd spent all these years, building silence and solitude into my life, and I thought, what a waste of time. What have you been doing? And I nearly threw in the towel. But then I had a further revelation, and it was this, that it was precisely because I had made space for silence and solitude that I had become self-reflective enough to notice. And had I not have done that, I still wouldn't have noticed, and I still wouldn't have been doing anything very much, and I certainly wouldn't be standing here talking about it. So in making that space, and I believe I was drawn into making that space for a number of years, I was quiet enough to hear something that I needed to have heard 35 years ago, actually. So don't give up in doing this. Don't give in to the belief that making space is a waste of time. It is only a waste of time if it is an end in itself, and we're not prepared to learn the lessons that it teaches us. Ultimately, making space grounds us in God and the God leads us forward into a wider and more well-lived life, and that has most certainly been my experience. And I'm just incredibly grateful for the lessons over the years that spending this time has taught me and continues to teach me. As I say, it's lifelong. So before we practice, I'm wondering if there's any questions or any comments that anybody would like to make. Feel free, you don't have to be silent now. Yes.
I'm used to silence because I do a little bush care, and up in Belair National Park on Saddle Hill Road, there's no traffic because it's a dead-end road right to the top. And I am in silence, and yet I'm not in true silence because there's the gentle sound of the leaves rustling, the birds in the distance, a bough creaking, and I find that type of pseudo-silence, if you like, I feel wonderful afterwards.
That's great.
What would you say about that sort of silence?
I think that's really important.
Nature silence.
Yeah, nature silence is really important. And I wouldn't refer to that, that's not the pseudo-silence that I'm referring to. The pseudo-silence I was referring to is really the kind of, or pseudo-spirituality, I would say, that it's not, it kind of strips the spirituality out of it in a way and makes it about me as opposed to God and being compassionate outwards. Do you see what I mean? So I think what you're talking about, which is the silence of nature, that's part of what we're tuning into, and the recognition that there is a speech that comes through nature as well. So no, what you're talking about is beautiful. I think that's really, really important, and we should be taking more time to notice that. And that's why actually spending time in your garden, if you are drawn to it, is really good, because the universe, God, the ground of our being, speaks to us through nature before anything else. So thank you for that. That's really important. Yes.
I think I'm controlling this one down here. Mandy, I'm, what would you say, a busy person in my head at any rate. And when I try to have times of silence, and I do try, my head still fills with thoughts and, you know, what about tomorrow or whatever else. I'm assuming that this just means that I need to practice more.
Well, I will reassure you a little bit. I've been spending time in silence for the best part of 15 years, and I don't think I'm any better at it. So be reassured by that. They refer to that as monkey mind. And it's very, very normal because our natural mind does think. So there are practices that can help with that, particularly. I haven't got the particular one there, but learning a form of meditation can help with that. There are a number that are going to help you to let go of your thoughts. As I say, I've been doing that for a number of years. I don't know if I'm any better at it, but part of it is just the perseverance of doing it, the discipline of doing it. Centering prayer is a really good practice, and I have a feeling that Gary, who's speaking in September, will talk about that, and I think he might be getting you to practice it as well. But yeah, be reassured that it's perfectly normal and it's okay, but just keep going, and it will be all right.
Can I offer a comment, partly to Peter and partly to you, Mandy?
Yes.
That the idea when you sit quietly, I must make my brain quiet, it's kind of, I have always found that to be completely useless because it won't shut up unless I let go of that intention that it needs to shut up. And so, like Micah does, paying attention to the sounds of the bird calls, or whatever else is around you, or paying attention to your body, as in some kinds of Buddhist meditation, and allowing your attention to go there. It's a much gentler form of attention, isn't it?
That's right.
It's not a I have to do a thing or not do a thing.
No, that's right. And one form of meditation that some people find helpful, which is a Buddhist one, is when your thoughts come, is just notice them, and perhaps imagine that you're putting them in a boat and that they're floating away. So be gentle with the fact that there are thoughts, because they will come. It's just normal, but it's what you do with them. So yes, you're right. If you're stressing about, oh my goodness, there are thoughts, you're actually just making it worse. Just go, okay, there's a thought. I'm just going to let it go.
For people who are recovering from severe depression, other mental illness, one of the techniques that you're taught, people are taught, is mindfulness.
Yes.
Dr. Russell Harris is an expert there, and he has several CDs and so on. And one of the very effective mindfulness studies or practice is to develop awareness of your breath.
Yes, breathing is an important one, that's true.
And all of the aspects of breathing, the chest rising, the lungs filling from the bottom, then coming up, and cool air going in and it's warmer coming out, and all of the things related to breathing. And there are many other things. And this is to help you to switch off from extraneous thoughts.
Yes.
You can't, as you said, you can't stop them. You can try to park them to the side. But these mindfulness exercises are a great assistance in the practice of the sound of silence, basically.
Yes, thank you for that. Anybody else?
I was taken by Heather and Peter's comments about the words and the noises in our head, and you're trying to sit there and you're just seeing all these words and phrases. And one way that I've loved it being described is actually becoming aware that you're actually witnessing your own thoughts.
Yes.
And the idea that philosophically that's very interesting. I'm not only thinking my thoughts, but I'm witnessing my thoughts.
Yes.
And if you become the silent witness of the thoughts that this thinker is thinking, you go, is there two of me? But the idea that you can actually witness your thoughts without actually following them down the rabbit hole that they want to go.
That's right. That's really important because, and in mental health, that's really important too, because you learn that you are not your thoughts, that you are actually separate to your thoughts, and if you can learn to let them go, that can be really helpful with your mental health, actually. Yeah, that's a really important point, Michael. Thank you. Anything else before we go into a time of practice, if you're happy to do that? All right. So what I'd like to do is lead us through a practice of Lectio Divina, or sacred reading. This is a practice, as I say, I'll frighten you a bit now. Traditionally, this is done in monasteries for 3 or 4 hours a day, and obviously I'm expecting that you will be doing that within the... No. I say traditionally, I don't think they do it for as long as that. But it is a daily practice, and it's a very important way of learning of what's going on within you. And the idea is that you read a passage 3 or 4 times. There's technical words to it. I'm not going to go through all that because I just don't think you need to know it. But in essence, we read a passage, and you can do this at home, and it's important that you do it out loud, actually. the reason for that is that you're hearing it in multiple ways. You're hearing it with your ears, you're reading it with your eyes, and you're speaking it with your lips. So you're getting multiple stimuli. You're much more likely to remember what it is that you are reading. And the idea is that you read the passage 3 or 4 times and leaving space for reflection in between. And you're looking for what jumps out at you. What is it that you are drawn to? It's not about learning what the passage means or anything like that, but what is it that speaks to you? Why has a particular word jumped out? And allowing yourself to reflect and to go with that. So I'm going to lead you through this evening. I'm not going to do it with scripture. I'm going to do it with a poem today. And what I'm going to do is read this poem 4 times. So what I'd like you to do, if you're comfortable, if you could get yourself comfortable. If you would like, as part of this process, you might want to journal and write something down. There's paper and pens available if you'd like. Thank you. So if you'd like to do that and that's helpful, then feel free to do that as you go. And so I'll just lead you through it. So if you get yourself nice and comfortable. So I'm going to read this poem 4 times, and I'm going to stop after each reading to give you time for you to think and ponder between each reading. As I say, if you'd like to, you're welcome to write your thoughts down as we go. So Michael's bringing around the pens and papers. Thank you. So settle yourself comfortably. Allow yourself to be relaxed but alert. Allow your attention to rest on your breath and breathe in and out deeply a few times until you feel relaxed. Become truly aware of what's happening just in this moment. So I'm going to read this passage for the first time slowly, and as I do so, I want you to notice any words or phrases that come to mind. What jumps out at you as I read? Even if you're not sure why the word or phrase is significant, just sit with it and perhaps repeat it gently to yourself. So this is Fire by Judy Brown. What makes a fire burn is space between the logs, a breathing space. Too much of a good thing, too many logs packed in too tight, can douse the flames almost as surely as a pail of water would. So building fires requires attention to the spaces in between as much as to the wood. When we are able to build open spaces in the same way we have learned to pile on the logs, then we can come to see how it is fuel and absence of the fuel together that make fire possible. We only need to lay a log lightly from time to time. A fire grows simply because the space is there, with openings in which the flame that knows just how it wants to burn can find its way. As I read the text again, allow the word or phrase that caught your attention to awaken your imagination. Allow your mind to examine it. What does it bring to mind for you? Does it remind you of a smell, a taste, or something you have seen, for example? What feelings are woken within you, or what images come to mind? Welcome what comes and let yourself experience and savour it. What makes a fire burn is space between the logs, a breathing space. Too much of a good thing, too many logs packed in too tight, can douse the flames almost as surely as a pail of water would. So building fires requires attention to the spaces in between, as much as to the wood. When we are able to build open spaces in the same way we have learned to pile on the logs, then we can come to see how it is fuel and absence of the fuel together that make fire possible. We only need to lay a log lightly from time to time. A fire grows simply because the space is there, with openings in which the flame that knows just how it wants to burn can find its way. As I read the text for the third time, consider whether there is any learning from this experience. What has been awoken within you, whether it's a memory, an image, or a feeling? Are you being invited to a new awareness, understanding, or to take action in some way? What makes a fire burn is space between the logs, a breathing space. Too much of a good thing, too many logs, packed in too tight, can douse the flames almost as surely as a pail of water would. So building fires requires attention to the spaces in between, as much as to the wood. When we are able to build open spaces in the same way we have learned to pile on the logs, then we can come to see how it is fuel and the absence of the fuel together that make fire possible. We only need to lay a log lightly from time to time. A fire grows simply because the space is there, with openings in which the flame that knows just how it wants to burn can find its way. as I read for the final time, move into a time of simply resting in what's happening for you. Allow yourself to be grateful for what you've received during this experience. Rest quietly and sink into the stillness. And if you become distracted, return to your breathing. What makes a fire burn is space between the logs, a breathing space. Too much of a good thing, too many logs packed in too tight, can douse the flames almost as surely as a pail of water would. So building fires requires attention to the spaces in between, as much as to the wood. When we are able to build open spaces in the same way we have learned to pile on the logs, then we can come to see how it is fuel and absence of the fuel together that make fire possible. We only need to lay a log lightly from time to time. A fire grows simply because the space is there with openings in which the flame that knows just how it wants to burn can find its way. Now I'd like to invite you to reconnect with your breathing in and out. Very gently bring your awareness back into the room, moving from this inner experience to your experience of being here right now. And give yourself a little time to transition back into your ordinary awareness. So how was that? You all did very, very well. Would anybody like to make any comment about anything they might have learned through that experience? No pressure at all, but if you'd like to share, you would be more than welcome.
I found in the first reading of the poem that my mind latched onto the spaces in between.
Okay.
And that just became the focal point, and then I almost stopped listening to the rest.
Yes.
It just washed over me, just
Yep.
like this gentle wave as I held onto that phrase.
Yes, and that's an important one to know as well, is if you're doing this on your own, you know, that at the point where you find your phrase, you just stop reading. Stop reading and then just meditate on what it is that's come to you. In a monastery, when they used to traditionally do this in St. Benedict's Day, they would do it in a group like this and have somebody out front reading, as I am. And the reason they would do that was because most of the monks were illiterate. And part of what Benedict was doing was actually teaching the monks to read. But so initially, what would happen is the monk would continue reading again and again and again until everybody would leave. So you'd go to your cell, as we talked earlier, and just meditate on it on your own. So they would just read again and again until everybody's gone. It could take a long time. But now in monasteries they would, they're not illiterate, so they would usually do it in their room, and that's the practice. Is yes, you find your phrase or word and stop reading and just allow yourself to go with it. So yeah, thanks, Michael. Anybody else have any thoughts or comments on that? Yes.
Thanks, Mandy. I could see the fire. I could see those bright orange flames, and they were dancing because they had space and room to move.
Wonderful.
That was my first impression with the first reading. And the second reading, I probably lost track, but the openness. There's openness between the logs, and it made me think of being with another.
Okay.
And allowing openness and space between one another for growth, for life, for energy.
Okay.
It's creative. It allows creativity.
Yes, that's really interesting, yes.
And it's not possessive. That was something else I discovered.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I was still hearing things with the fourth reading that I hadn't heard in the first, second or third. I didn't hear about the pail of water until the fourth. Not sure where that was. Did you say that in the other three readings?
Yes, I
You
did.
sure?
Yes, definitely, exactly the same.
I just found it was delightful.
Oh,
Thank
good.
you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for that.
Just realised that I'm in 29th year of recovery addiction.
Okay.
Most people in here know that. And I've been placing a log gently from time to time for those 29 years in recovery.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. I have a little bit of a story to share. When I did this in a mental health ward at the QEH, once I read this particular and did exactly this with this particular poem, and there was a gentleman there who, for him, it was very personal, because what came up for him was that he'd been in a fire as a child, and it brought up for him all the emotion involved with that. And that can be part of what this will do, is to bring up some of those painful things, which means it's really important that you have somebody that you can talk to if you need to. Because sometimes it's wonderful what comes up when you read something like this. Other times it can be quite painful. But it was interesting in that situation, what it brought up for that gentleman. Yeah. Anybody else? How was the experience of that? How was it? Was it okay? Yeah, I've got a nice nod there, thank you. Yes.
I appreciated the words. There was a cliche at the beginning which got in my way.
Oh, go, yes.
It's a cliche that shouldn't be in a poem, but you know, I was able to get past that.
That's good.
And that fuel or the absence of fuel together that make a flame, that grabbed me first.
Okay.
And second time round, I saw a fire in the lounge of a farmyard, and people sitting around the fire and just talking.
Okay.
And the third time around, an insight. Fuel and the absence of fuel together make a fire possible.
Yes.
Which was a wonderful line. And then, even stronger, we only need to lay a log lightly from time to time. And that had application for me the way I talk with our adult children.
Okay.
So it sort of had layers.
Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you.
There's a Simon and Garfunkel song called The Sound of Silence.
Yes, that's right.
I have sung it so many times, but with your wonderful soothing words, it made me think that I've been singing this song and really not thinking about it, because you think about it logically and rationally. Silence cannot have a sound. It's contradictory.
Yes, that's true, isn't it?
But we know what we mean.
Yes.
We understand what we
Yes.
mean by the sound of silence.
Yes, that's right. Yes, thank you. And you realise you can practice Lectio Divina on music if you wanted to. So maybe now that we've done this and that's caused you to reflect on that song, maybe you could listen to that song and see if it says something differently to you, and using the same kind of process. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Not just a song anymore.
Reminds me of someone saying once that without the silence between the words and the silence between the notes in music, it would just be noise.
Just be noise, that's right.
So it's the silence and the sounds that make it. One thing I was going to ask, Mandy, you mentioned something earlier in answer to a question by Peter about you could try centering prayer.
Yes.
Would you like to share with people what you mean by centering prayer?
Centering prayer, yes. Centering prayer, I mean, it is actually a form of silent meditation. It is referred to as a prayer rather than a meditation because its intention is to sit quietly with God. You often hear the phrase intermingled with or interchangeable with contemplative prayer, but I won't go into the details of the difference, but the technique of centering prayer, which is essentially to do with when the thoughts come, just let them go. The idea that eventually as you do that you would come to what's known as the still point, which is total internal silence, which is very rare, it doesn't happen very often, and which is what contemplation is, if that makes sense. I don't want to make it sound too technical if I am, but it's usually done 20 minutes at a time. It's a bit different to Buddhist meditation in that you just let go of the thoughts as they come, and you would normally have a sacred word that you would say, a mantra of some description to repeat to yourself, just to keep your mind busy. And then as you do it, you would just let it go into the silence. And every time a thought comes up again, just notice that the thought is there, let it go and repeat your sacred word until you can let that go as well. It was developed in this particular practice in the 60s and 70s by Thomas Keating, Basil Pennington, I think, and William Menninger. And I think that Gary's, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but I think Gary's going to talk about that in September, I have a feeling. But you can read up on it, and if you are able to include that in your spiritual practice, it's a good one, and it does help with the monkey mind. Not that ever truly disappears, but I hope that wasn't too technical. Sorry. Any other questions before we end? All right. Yes, Marnie.
I just had a comment.
Yeah.
Listening and thinking about silence. Well, we've been talking and thinking about silence reminded me of something that happened the other night when I was listening to my 6-year-old granddaughter learning to read. And she suddenly said, "Oh, a full stop. I've got to stop and be quiet. And if I do that, then the sentences make sense."
That's really good. I like that.
So I thought that was a nice way of thinking about
Yes.
silence, making the rest of it make sense.
And sometimes the 6-year-olds know better than we do, don't they? Well, thank you, everybody. It's been really lovely to be here this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I've really enjoyed being here. At the table there's some literature if you want to take something home. And if you have any other questions or comments, then feel free to ask me afterwards. And yeah, thank you for having me. It's been very nice.
Mandy, we can't let you go empty-handed. This
lovely,
originally would have come from the ground.
Yes, wonderful. And it's going to go straight into my tummy. Thank you. Yes, thank you. That's lovely.
Thank you, Mandy, very much for sharing of your journey and encouraging us in our journey.
You're welcome. Thank you for
I think
having me.
each one of us will take something, and it'll be probably different for each one of us.
Yes, of course.
Some ideas. Maybe we will become less busy, less nervous of silence, more open to silence. And I must admit, I tend to do silence when I'm walking.
Yes.
I know probably it's better if you're not walking, but I find that when I'm walking, I can become more aware of just what's around me. And but if I'm sitting,
it's not as easy. Yeah, and that's fine.
I go sleep then.
We're all different, and we all do it differently, and that is fine.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's wonderful.
Oh, good. I'll say Mandy said it was all right. Thank you, Mandy.
Thank you.